In the year 1177 BC, a king named Ramesses III stood on the shores of the Nile Delta and watched a fleet of foreign ships approach that should not have existed. The men aboard them had no homeland anymore. Their cities were ash, their kings were dead, and they were sailing straight for the last great power left standing on Earth. 50 years earlier, the world had been perfect. 5 empires, Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Assyria, and Babylon, traded gold, rode each other as brothers, and ruled a connected international system more sophisticated than anything that would exist again for 1,000 years. Kings called each other "my brother." Merchant ships carried tin from Britain to bronze workshops in Cyprus to palaces in Greece. It was, by every measure, a golden age. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, all of it ended. Not one empire, not 2. Every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East collapsed nearly simultaneously, and most of them never came back. Cities that had stood for 800 years were burned and never rebuilt. Writing systems vanished so completely that when Greek civilization re-emerged centuries later, its people had no memory their own ancestors could even write. Trade routes that spanned 3,000 miles disappeared overnight. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. It is the single greatest system failure in recorded human history. And for decades, nobody could agree on what caused it. This is the story of the last great age of bronze, the 50 years that ended it, and the invisible network of kings, ships, and trade that fell apart so completely it nearly erased itself from memory. To understand how something this big could fall, you first have to understand how big it actually was. By 1300 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was not a patchwork of isolated kingdoms. It was something closer to a single interlocked economy, what modern historians now call the Late Bronze Age international system. 5 major powers anchored it: the Egyptian Empire under the Pharaohs, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, Assyria in Mesopotamia, and Kassite Babylon. Beneath them sat a web of smaller vassal states, Ugarit, Alashia, Canaanite city-states, each one plugged into the same circulatory system of goods, diplomacy, and bronze. And bronze was the whole point. Every weapon, every tool, every plow that fed these empires depended on one alloy: copper mixed with tin. Copper was common enough, tin was not. The nearest major tin sources lay over 1,000 miles from most Bronze Age palaces, in Afghanistan, or possibly as far away as Britain and Iberia, which meant that every kingdom, no matter how powerful, was permanently dependent on long-distance trade just to arm its own soldiers. We know exactly how this system worked because of one shipwreck. In 1982, a Turkish sponge diver found a late Bronze Age merchant vessel off the coast of Uluburun, sunk around 1300 BC. When archaeologists raised its cargo, they found 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin, enough bronze to equip an army, alongside ostrich egg shells from Africa, ebony from Nubia, amber from the Baltic, and pottery from Cyprus, Canaan, and Mycenae, all on a single ship. That is not a local trader. That is a floating cross-section of an entire interconnected world. The palaces that ran this system left behind their own paper trail. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets found in Egypt, record real correspondence between the pharaoh and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittites, addressing each other as equals, as brothers, requesting gold, negotiating marriages, and occasionally complaining that the last gift shipment was insultingly small. This was a world running at the edge of its own complexity, rich, interconnected, and, though no one could have known it yet, entirely dependent on every piece staying in place at once. At its height, this was arguably the most cosmopolitan world humanity had ever built. Egypt, under Amenhotep III and later Ramses II, controlled a wealth engine unmatched anywhere on Earth. Gold poured in from Nubian mines so reliably that other kings openly joked that in Egypt, gold was as common as dirt. Ramses II fought the Hittites to a bloody standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, and the peace treaty that followed, the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history, didn't just end a war, it bound two rival superpowers into decades of stability, intermarriage, and trade. The Hittites, meanwhile, controlled something almost as valuable as gold, the technology of ironworking, still a jealously guarded secret, and a monopoly on the overland trade routes linking Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Their capital, Hattusa, held one of the largest royal archives in the ancient world, tens of thousands of clay tablets recording treaties, myths, and laws. Across the sea, Mycenaean Greece was building the world later Greeks would mythologize as the age of Agamemnon and Achilles. Massive palace complexes at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns coordinated an economy so administratively complex that scribes tracked individual sheep and specific quantities of perfumed oil on clay tablets written in a script called Linear B, a bureaucracy that wouldn't be matched in Greece again for over 500 years. And sitting in the middle of it all was the small trading city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria. Ugarit wasn't an empire, it didn't need to be. It was the connective tissue, a port where Egyptian, Hittite, Cypriot, and Mycenaean merchants all did business, and where scribes wrote in at least 8 different languages side by side. Ugarit's archives are, in many ways, the clearest single window we have into how genuinely interconnected this world had become. This was globalization, 3,000 years early. And like every system built on interdependence, it had a hidden vulnerability. It only worked if every part of the network kept functioning at once. Then, within the span of about 40 years, letters started arriving that no king wanted to read. The clearest warning survives on a clay tablet from Ugarit, never sent, found still baking in a kiln because the city was destroyed before the scribe could fire it. It's a desperate message from the king of Ugarit to the king of Al-Ashia, and it says, in essence, the enemy's ships have already burned our towns, and our own army and chariots are stationed elsewhere. We are alone. Send help. No help came. Ugarit, a city that had stood for over 4,000 years, was burned to the ground around 1185 BC and never rebuilt. Arrowheads have been found embedded in its walls. The attackers appear in Egyptian records under one collective name, the Sea Peoples. Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu contains the most detailed account we have, describing a coalition of sea-borne raiders who had already destroyed the Hittite Empire, ravaged Cyprus, and swept down the Levantine coast, uprooting entire populations as they came. The inscription lists names: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, groups modern historians still argue over, some possibly refugees from the very civilizations already collapsing, now turned into an unstoppable migrating horde with nothing left to lose. Egypt fought them off, barely. Ramesses III's forces won a decisive naval battle in the Nile Delta around 1725 BC in a fight depicted in extraordinary detail on the temple walls at Medinet Habu, showing Sea People's ships trapped and destroyed by Egyptian archers firing from shore. It's one of the earliest recorded naval battles in human history. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples, but it survived into a world where almost nobody else had. For decades, the Sea Peoples were treated as the single cause of the Bronze Age collapse, an invading horde that simply toppled everything in its path. Modern archaeology tells a more unsettling story. The Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were one symptom of a system that was already failing everywhere at once. Here is what actually seems to have happened, pieced together from ice cores, pollen samples, shipwrecks, and clay jablets. Not one catastrophe, but 4 or 5 arriving in the same 50-year window and feeding each other. The first was climate. Pollen records and isotope analysis from the eastern Mediterranean point to a sustained, severe drought beginning around 1200 BC, precisely when the collapse begins. Hittite royal correspondence from this exact period includes desperate requests to Egypt for emergency grain shipments, something a supposedly dominant empire should never need to ask for. The second was earthquakes. Archaeologists have identified a cluster of major seismic events across the region in this same window, so consistent in the archaeological layers that some researchers call it an earthquake storm. Cities like Mycenae and Tiryns show destruction layers consistent with quake damage, sometimes followed by fire, sometimes rebuilt smaller and poorer, never at their former scale. The third was systemic economic fragility, the same interdependence that had made the Bronze Age Golden Age possible. Because every kingdom depended on long-distance tin routes for the bronze that armed its soldiers and plowed its fields, a disruption anywhere in the network, a burned port, a mountain pass, a fleet of pirates in the wrong strait, could starve every kingdom downstream of it simultaneously. A famine in one country was no longer a local problem. It could cascade through 8 economies in a single trading season. The fourth was internal collapse. Peasant uprisings and elite infighting, hinted at in surviving records from Mesopotamia and the Levant, describing internal unrest and breakdowns in central authority even before outside attackers arrived at the gates. None of these alone would have ended the Bronze Age. Drought alone had happened before. Earthquakes alone had happened before. But drought, quake, famine, and invasion layered on top of a system with zero redundancy, where every kingdom's survival depended on every other kingdom staying intact, that combination had never happened before, and the system simply had no capacity to absorb it. It is not so different from a modern world that runs on a handful of oil pipelines and a single island's microchip factories. Remove any one link, and everyone downstream feels it within weeks, not centuries. The Hittite Empire, one of the 2 superpowers of the ancient world, disappears from the historical record so completely and so suddenly that archaeologists still debate exactly how its capital, Hattusa, actually fell. By around 1180 BC, the city was abandoned, not looted for treasure in the way conquerors usually loot a capital, but stripped of its most portable valuables by what appears to have been its own fleeing population, then left to burn. An empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill simply stopped existing within a generation. Mycenaean Greece fared just as badly. Palace after palace, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, was destroyed within the same narrow window. And when they fell, they took something irreplaceable with them: writing itself. The Linear B script was known only to a small class of palace scribes, and when the palaces burned, literacy in Greece vanished with them. For the next 300 to 400 years, a period historians literally called the Greek Dark Ages, the Greek world lost the ability to write entirely. When the Greeks picked up writing again, they had to borrow and adapt a completely different script from the Phoenicians. Homer's epics, describing a war fought by kings whose own writing system he had never even heard of, are the folk memory of a civilization that had forgotten it once had bureaucrats. Babylon and Assyria weakened severely, entering a prolonged period of reduced power and territorial contraction. Cyprus's copper trading network, once central to the entire bronze economy, was disrupted for generations. Only Egypt survived as a continuous state, but a diminished one. Ramesses III's victory bought time, not a restoration. Within decades, Egypt lost its Near Eastern territories, and the new kingdom entered its own long, slow decline. By 1150 BC, the interconnected Bronze Age world, the one that had produced peace treaties, royal marriages, and a shipwreck carrying goods from 4 continents, was simply gone. Out of the wreckage came something genuinely new: the Iron Age. With the old bronze trade networks in ruins and tin farther to source, smiths across the region turned in earnest to a metal that didn't require a 1,000-mile supply chain: iron, extractable from ore that was locally abundant almost everywhere. The technology the Hittites had guarded as an imperial secret spread rapidly once their empire could no longer control it, and within a few centuries, iron tools and weapons had replaced bronze across the entire region. The political map was rebuilt from the ground up. The power vacuum in the Levant allowed smaller kingdoms and peoples to rise where Egyptian and Hittite dominance had once suffocated them, including the Phoenician city-states, who would go on to spread their alphabet across the Mediterranean, and later various Israelite and Aramaean kingdoms. And in Greece, out of 4 centuries of illiteracy and fragmentation, a completely different kind of civilization eventually re-emerged, smaller in scale than the Mycenaean palaces, but structured around independent city-states rather than centralized god-kings. That world would eventually produce Athens, Sparta, and the foundations of Greek civilization as we know it. The Bronze Age collapse is, in a strange way, the reason the ancient world we usually picture, Greek philosophers, Phoenician traders, the kingdoms of the Hebrew Bible, exists in the form it does. It took the total destruction of one interconnected golden age to clear the ground for the next one. Modern historians increasingly treat 1177 BC not as a single event, but as a case study in systemic collapse, a warning about what happens when complex, deeply interdependent systems lose their ability to absorb multiple shocks at once. Climate stress, supply chain failure, and political fragility didn't destroy Bronze Age civilization one at a time. They arrived together, and the system had built no redundancy for that. For over a century after Ramesses III's reign, Egyptian temple walls remained the only place on Earth that still remembered the Sea Peoples. Everywhere else, the archives simply stop. That is what makes the Bronze Age collapse different from every other fall in this series. This wasn't one empire toppled by a rival, or one dynasty replaced by the next. This was an entire interconnected world, 5 superpowers, 1,000 years of accumulated writing, art, and trade, erased so completely that later civilizations had to reinvent parts of it from scratch. If this is the kind of history nobody taught you, subscribe. House of Wisdom exists to tell the stories the mainstream history channels leave out. And let me know in the comments which fallen civilization from this era do you want told next.